The morning sun filtered through the tall glass windows of the Hawthorne estate, illuminating the immaculate marble floors that never seemed to gather a single speck of dust. The mansion belonged to Ethan Hawthorne, a young millionaire whose name was whispered in business magazines and envied in high society circles. Ethan was brilliant, successful, and feared, not because of cruelty, but because of his cold, observant silence. He noticed everything, every detail, every flaw, every lie. Nothing escaped him, except, perhaps, the one thing he never bothered a second thought with: the quiet, almost invisible maid named Maria. Maria had worked there for a year, moving like a shadow, polite, discreet, always keeping her eyes lowered. Ethan barely knew the sound of her voice. She lived in the small maid's quarters at the far end of the mansion, a room Ethan had never once stepped inside. To him, she was simply one of the many employees who kept the house running flawlessly, someone he paid generously, but never truly saw. But that morning, something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Ethan had returned home earlier than planned after a meeting was unexpectedly cancelled. As he walked through the silent hallway near the service wing, he noticed a faint sound, a soft rustling, followed by what seemed like hurried breathing. It was coming from the maid's quarters. He frowned. That room was always quiet. Maria never made noise. She never stopped working long enough to. Curiosity pulled at him, a way he wasn't used to feeling. He approached the small wooden door, and just as he was about to knock, he heard something that made his spine stiffen. Money. Bills. Many bills. Being counted. Fast. Ethan froze. Maria's voice murmured something he couldn't fully understand. He recognized the crisp, unmistakable sound of large amounts of cash being handled, counted, reorganized, stacked. A maid, in his house, counting what sounded like thousands. A strange heat rushed through his chest. Shock, confusion, and something darker, something that tasted like betrayal. His heart beat louder than his footsteps as he slowly turned the doorknob and pushed it open just enough to see inside. And what he saw made the young millionaire's breath catch midair. Maria was kneeling on the floor of her tiny room, surrounded by stacks, dozens of stacks, of money. Bundles of cash so large they didn't even fit on the bed. She was counting them with trembling hands, whispering numbers under her breath, her expression a mixture of panic and desperation. It wasn't pocket money. It wasn't savings. It was a fortune. Ethan's pulse hammered in his ear. Why would a maid have that kind of money? Where did it come from? Had she stolen it? From him? The possibility hit him like a punch, tightening every muscle in his body. The young millionaire stood there frozen, watching the scene unfold, unable to move, unable to speak, and completely unaware that what he was witnessing was only the beginning of truth far more shocking than anything he could imagine. A truth that would only be revealed at the very, very end. The moment Ethan stepped away from the small storage room door, his mind became a storm that refused to settle. He moved down the hallway, but everything around him suddenly felt different, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets he had never bothered to listen to before. He kept replaying the image in his mind. Maria, the quiet, humble, clean, sitting on the floor of her tiny maid's room, counting stacks of cash that looked far too large, far too organized, far too suspicious for someone who earned what she did. He tried to tell himself he hadn't seen correctly, that maybe he was exaggerating, but the vision kept returning with absolute clarity. The money was real, the panic on her face was real, and the strange way she hid the bundles the second she noticed a shadow in the hallway, that was real too. Ethan couldn't focus on anything, not on the business calls waiting for, not on the meetings marked in his calendar, not even on the lunch his personal chef had. He sat at the massive marble counter in his kitchen, staring blankly at an untouched plate, his fingers tapping nervously against the stone. Why would she have that much money? He muttered to himself, and why hide it like? He had hired Maria 2 years earlier. She was quiet, never complained, never asked for anything, and always did her work with almost painful dedication. She arrived early, left late, and lived in the tiny servant's room at the back of the property because she insisted she had nowhere else to go. Ethan had always felt a quiet respect for her, even admiration. She was humble, hard-working, invisible in the way people who suffer too much often become. But that pile of money changed everything. His mind raced through possibilities. Did she steal from him? Was she involved with someone dangerous? Was she hiding something illegal? Or was there something else entirely? Something he couldn't yet understand? The questions pulled at him like hooks. He stood abruptly, unable to sit still, and walked to the security room at the far end of the house. Screens glowed with camera feeds, each one showing a different part of the estate. Every corner was protected, except the servants' area, the one spot he had never bothered to monitor closely because he believed in giving employees privacy, a mistake he now regretted. He hovered his fingers over the keyboard, tempted to access the older backup footage to see if Maria had done this before. But something stopped him. A strange, uneasy guilt. She's not a thief, he whispered to himself. She's not. But he wasn't sure anymore. Instead, he opened a live feed from the hallway near the back of the house, where her room was located. The door to her quarters was shut. No movement, no sound. He leaned closer, staring at the grainy image, as if answers would form from the pixels. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. Finally, he saw her. Maria stepped out of the room slowly, looking around nervously, her hands trembling slightly as she locked the door behind her. Her eyes looked tired, red, as though she had been crying. She held her cleaning supplies tightly against her chest, clutching them like a shield. Ethan felt something twist inside him, a mixture of confusion, worry, and suspicion. "Why hide money and cry afterward?" he whispered. He watched as she walked down the hallway, shoulders small and heavy, as if she carried an invisible burden no one else could see. And for the first time since he became a millionaire, he realized he was truly clueless about the lives of the people who worked for him. He needed to know the truth. Not tomorrow, not later, tonight. He stood, his decision made. But before confronting her, he needed to think, to plan, to understand what exactly he had walked into. Because deep down, he sensed one thing: whatever Maria was hiding, it was not simple, and it was not small. What he had seen was only the beginning, and the truth, he felt in his bones, would be far more unimaginable than anything he could guess. That night, the mansion felt strangely alive, as if every window, every hallway, every piece of furniture was holding its breath. Ethan couldn't sleep. He paced across his room, the city lights glittering through the glass walls behind him, but his mind was trapped elsewhere, back in that tiny servant's room, back in the moment he had seen Maria with the stacks of money she shouldn't have. He grabbed his phone more than once, tempted to call the police, or his head of security, or even his lawyer. But every time his thumb hovered over a number, a wave of hesitation stopped him. Something inside him whispered, "Don't rush. You don't know the whole story." And yet, the other part of him, the part that built a multi-million-dollar empire, warned that hesitation was dangerous. At 2:41 a.m., unable to tolerate the uncertainty that gnawed at him, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He would go to the servants' quarters. Alone. Now. He put on a simple hoodie, slipped quietly out of his room, and walked down the long corridor. The mansion was silent except for the faint humming of electronics and the occasional creak from the old wooden floorboards. Every step he took echoed with doubt. When he finally reached the isolated back section of the property, he stopped, in front of Maria's room. The door was old, painted white, chipped at the corners. A small golden number plate read, "Room 7, but the faded paint around it showed how long ago it had been replaced. He reached for the door handle. It turned, unlocked. It startled him. She had locked it earlier that day. He had seen it on the camera feed. Yet now, it was open. His heart pounded harder. He pushed the door gently, letting it creak open just enough to slip inside. The room was dim, lit only by the moonlight that passed through the small window above her narrow bed. Everything was neatly arranged, almost painfully organized. An ironed uniform hung on a hook, shoes lined up perfectly, a single photograph of a young boy placed carefully on a nightstand. Ethan crossed the room, stopped, and looked closely. The boy was smiling, maybe around 8 years old, holding a homemade kite. "Her son," he whispered. He had never asked her if she had family. He had never asked her, and he set the picture down gently and scanned the room, searching for the money he had seen earlier. It was nowhere. No bundles, no bags, no envelope, nothing. Ethan felt a prick of frustration. He checked the dresser drawers one by one. Only folded clothes. He opened the small wardrobe. Only uniforms and cheap coats. He looked under the bed. Only 2 worn suitcases, and a small wooden box filled with sewing needle and thread. "Where is it?" he murmured. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. The money had... He was absolutely certain. She couldn't have made it disappear in a single day, right? Unless she moved it, or someone forced her to move, or she wasn't acting alone. A soft sound suddenly broke the silence. The faintest creak from the hallway. Ethan froze. Someone was there. He moved to the corner of the room, positioning himself behind the wardrobe, his breath controlled, his pulse thundering in his ear. Another sound, a cautious footstep. Then, shadow of someone slowly passed under the crack of the door. Ethan's mind raced. Was it Maria? Was it a thief? Was it someone connected to that money? The doorknob turned, slowly, quietly. Whoever was outside didn't want to be noticed. The door opened just an inch, then another. A silhouette entered, small and familiar. It was Maria. She closed the door behind her carefully and took 2 unsteady steps inside, her shoulders trembling as if she were battling an invisible weight. Ethan watched her silently from the dark corner. She approached the bed, lifted her pillow, and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key tied with a red ribbon. She held it between her fingers as though it were something sacred, something. With a shaky breath, she knelt in front of the wooden floorboard dresser. a specific board, as if she had memorized exactly which one to she slipped the tip of the floorboard. Ethan's eyes widened. There was a hiding place. A secret one. She reached inside and pulled out the thing he had been searching for. A large envelope, old, thick, stuffed with cash. But not only cash. There were documents, papers, photographs, and something that looked like a hospital bracelet. She pressed the envelope against her chest, closed her eyes tightly, and whispered something Ethan could barely hear. Perdóname, Dios mío. Dame fuerza. Mañana será, o fin. Tomorrow will be the end. Ethan felt a jolt of fear run through him. He took a step forward. A deliberate. The floor creaked beneath his foot. Maria gasped and spun around, her eyes widening in sheer terror when she saw him standing in the dim moonlight, half shadow, half silhouette. Her hands shook violently. Her breath stopped. The envelope almost slipped from her fingers. "Mr. Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound. You weren't supposed to know." Ethan stepped closer, his voice steady but firm. "Maria, what's going on?" Her lips trembled. She clutched the envelope tighter, and with tears already forming in her eyes, she whispered, "Sir, please, let me explain. But once you hear the truth, your life will never be the same." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath him. He knew this moment would change everything, because whatever she was about to reveal was the real beginning of a story far more dangerous, far more emotional, and far more unimaginable than anything he could have imagined. The moment Maria whispered those words, the entire atmosphere of the tiny room changed. It felt as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ethan's pulse pounded heavily in his chest, yet he forced himself to stay still, to give her space to speak. Whatever truth she was about to reveal clearly carried a weight she had been hiding for far too long. Maria swallowed hard, eyes shimmering with tears she tried desperately to hold back. Her hands were trembling so fiercely that Ethan almost reached out to steady her, but he stopped himself. He didn't want to scare her even more. "Maria," he said softly, "whatever it is, I want to understand." She shook her head weakly, as if unsure whether she had the right to share the truth or the strength to face it. "No, senor, you don't understand," she whispered. "My life, all of this, it is more dangerous than you." She slowly lowered herself to sit on the edge of the bed, gripping the thick envelope as though it were the only anchor keeping her from collapsing. Ethan moved closer, but not too close. He could see she was at the edge of fear, and he didn't want to push her over it. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was suffocating, heavy with unspoken memories and secrets buried under years of struggle. Finally, Maria took a shaking breath and said, "I didn't steal this money." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had never accused her. Not aloud, but he didn't deny that the thought had crossed his mind. "I believe," he said softly. She looked up sharply, as if startled by the unexpected compassion. Her voice cracked. "It's not mine. It was never mine. I was only keeping it safe." "For who?" Ethan asked. Maria closed her eyes. "For a man who is no longer alive." A shiver ran through Ethan's spine. She held the envelope tighter and continued, her voice trembling. "This money, these papers, they belonged to my husband." Ethan blinked, stunned. In all the months she had worked for him, she had never once mentioned a husband, not even a hint. "He died 10 years ago," she added in a painfully soft whisper. "And before he died, he hid something that people are still searching for." Ethan's eyebrows furrowed. "People? What people?" Maria shook her head, her breath ragged. "Dangerous people. People who believe he stole something from them. They think I know where it is, and that one day I will betray them and give it to the wrong person." Ethan's heartbeat grew louder. "Are you saying you're in danger?" She gave a small, broken smile, one that told him she had been living with fear for far longer than he could comprehend. "Every day," she whispered. "Every hour." She opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a stack of photographs. Ethan leaned closer to see them. The images were old, faded in some areas, but unmistakable. They showed her husband, standing beside shady men in alleyways, exchanging briefcases, shaking hands, counting money under the table. "This can't be," Maria said, wiping tears from her cheeks. "My husband was not the man I thought he was. He got involved with criminals. He had debts. He owed money to people who never forgive and never forget." She reached deeper into the envelope and pulled out several documents. Ethan recognized the logos immediately. Offshore bank accounts, transactional transfers, encrypted notes that looked too professional for an ordinary laborer. "Before he died," Maria continued, "he told me that if something ever happened to him, I must protect these papers. He said they were proof that the money he owed had been paid, and proof that someone else was involved, someone powerful." The last word hung in the air like a shadow. Ethan felt a knot tighten in his chest. "And you think these people are still watching you?" he asked. "I know they are," Maria said. her voice breaking. They followed me here. Ethan stiffened. Followed her? To his mansion? A cold wave of realization washed over him. If dangerous people were tracking her, then they were also watching him. His home, his routines, everything. Maria looked up at him again, her eyes filled with desperation. Senor Ethan, I came to this job not to steal from you, not to lie to you. I came here because I thought this house, this big house with guards and cameras, would be the one place they'd never dare to enter. Her voice cracked. But I was wrong. They found. Ethan's chest tightened. How do you know? Maria reached into the envelope once more and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. She held it out to Ethan with shaking fingers. He unfolded it slowly. The message was written in rough, rushed handwriting. We know where you are. You have 1 week. Ethan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a secret. This was a threat, a real one. He looked at Maria, who was now openly crying, shoulders trembling as she tried to breathe. I didn't want to bring this to your home, she sobbed. I didn't want to involve you. That is why I hide the money, why I hide everything. I thought if I kept quiet, if I stayed invisible, they would forget me. She shook her head. But they won't. They never forget. Ethan's emotions tangled. Fear, confusion, anger, and a sudden fierce protectiveness he didn't know he had. Maria, he said firmly, you should have told me. She looked up, eyes red and swollen. You are my boss, she whispered, not my protector. Ethan knelt down so they were eye level, his voice softer than before. Maybe I can be both. Maria's breath caught in her throat, but before she could respond, before Ethan could process the weight of everything he had just learned, there was a sharp sound outside the room, a click, then a slow, heavy step in the hallway. Ethan and Maria froze. Another step, then another. Someone was outside, someone who didn't belong there. Maria's face drained of color. It's them, she whispered, and for the first time, Ethan realized this wasn't just her secret anymore. It was now his problem, and it was about to get worse. Much, much worse. The footsteps in the hallway were slow, deliberate, and heavy enough to make the thin walls of the servants' quarters vibrate. Ethan felt every muscle in his body tighten. Maria's fingers dug into the envelope as though it were a lifeline, her breathing now quick, shallow, and barely under control. Ethan lifted one hand gently, signaling her to stay silent. She nodded, tears silently slipping down her face. For a moment, the hallway went quiet. Too quiet. Ethan stepped toward the door as silently as he could, positioning himself so he could see a sliver of the hallway through the narrow crack between the door and its frame. His heart thundered against his ribs, but his mind, forged by years of high-stakes business deals, cutthroat negotiations, and instinct sharpened through pressure, forced him to stay focused. A shadow flickered on the opposite wall. Someone was standing just out of sight, waiting, listening. Ethan's jaw clenched. Whoever it was, they weren't a servant. He knew every staff member by silhouette, and they weren't moving like someone familiar with the house. Their presence felt wrong. The shadow shifted again, and Ethan saw the unmistakable shape of a boot, heavy, worn, and coated with dirt. Not the kind of boots any employee in his mansion wore. Ethan felt a cold realization settle into his bones. Someone had entered his home, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Maria covered her mouth to hold back a soft whimper. Ethan glanced at her and shook his head gently, silently telling her to stay quiet, stay still. But then, a voice, low, rough, male, and disturbingly calm. I know you're in there. Maria's entire body shuddered. Ethan felt frozen for a second, then forced himself to breathe. Another footstep, then another. I said I know you're in there. Ethan's breath stopped. They knew her name. Her name. Maria pressed her back against the wall, sliding down until she sat on the floor, shaking uncontrollably. Her hand covered her heart, as if she could physically hold it together. The man outside chuckled, a low, cruel sound that Ethan's stomach twist. You thought you could hide forever. A pause. You really thought we would stop looking for what belongs to us? Ethan's blood turned to ice. Maria clutched the envelope harder. The man continued, his voice thick with threat. We gave you time. We gave you 10 years. And now? He dragged a finger slowly across the door. The sound of his nails scraping the wood was sharp, agonizing, deliberate. Time is up. Maria's breathing became a series of tiny gasps. Ethan stepped back toward her quickly, lowering himself to her level. Maria, he whispered urgently, you need to tell me everything. Now. She shook her head frantically. No, 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 Senor Ethan. You don't understand. If you get involved, I am involved, he hissed softly. They're in my house. I need to know what I'm protecting. Maria's lips trembled. Her eyes didn't blink. She looked like someone fighting against the flood of memories she had pushed down, memories too heavy for one person to carry. Outside, the footsteps stopped again. Silence. Then, a loud bang against the door. Maria flinched violently. Letting out a muffled scream she tried desperately to swallow. Ethan grabbed her hand instinctively, trying to ground her. But she pulled away, not rejecting his help, but terrified of dragging him further into her nightmare. The man outside laughed again, a chilling, satisfied laugh. "Maybe you won't open this door," he growled. "But doors are just wood." Another bang, harder. Ethan looked around the small room quickly. There was no other exit. No window big enough to escape. No furniture strong enough to block a full-grown man. They were trapped. Ethan's mind raced. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. But just as his thumb hit the screen, he saw it. No signal. His mansion, built on a hill, usually had perfect coverage everywhere. But here, deep in the far servants' wing, surrounded by reinforced structure, the signal was weak at the best of times. Now, there was nothing. Maria whispered through trembling lips. "They jammed it." Ethan stared at. "What?" She nodded frantically, tears falling. "They have a device. A signal blocker. They used it before." Ethan's chest tightened. They weren't just criminal. They were organized, prepared, experienced. And they were inside his home. The banging resumed, harder now, making the thin wooden door rattle its hinges. "You can't run forever, Maria," the man shouted. "You know what we want." Ethan leaned closer to her, his voice urgent. "What do they want, Maria? What did your husband steal?" Her hand shook as she opened the envelope again. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, fragile, yellowed, and torn at the edges. "This," she whispered. Ethan took it carefully and examined it. At first glance, it looked like a document filled with numbers, coordinates, and signatures. But then, at the bottom, a symbol caught his eye. A crest. Luxurious. Private. Recognizable. Ethan knew that symbol. It belonged to one of the wealthiest and most ruthless families in the country. A family whose name never made the news because they owned the people. News. Ethan felt his breath leave him all at once. This is... Maria nodded quickly, terror in her eyes. "Yes. My husband worked for them. He saw something he shouldn't have. He took something he shouldn't have. This paper proves everything. It shows where they hide their assets, their illegal assets. Offshore, untaxed, untouchable." Ethan felt dizzy. "And your husband?" "He tried to expose them, and he died for it." The envelope slipped from her hands and fell to the floor. Outside, the banging grew louder. "Maria, I'm losing my patience." Ethan stood up, adrenaline flooding his body. He scanned the room. Again, no weapons, no protection, nothing that could buy them more than a few seconds once the door gave way. But then something unusual caught his attention. A vent, small, hidden near the ceiling, barely noticeable unless you were searching. He stepped onto the bed and pushed against the metal. It loosened. Behind it, a narrow crawl space. Not enough for him, but enough for Maria. He dropped back down. "Maria," he said sharply, "you can escape through the vent." She shook her head, violently. "No, Senor Ethan, they'll kill you if you stay." The door cracked. A piece of wood splintered off. Maria screamed and covered her mouth. Ethan grabbed her shoulders gently but firmly. "Listen to me. You have to trust me. Get inside that vent. Now. It goes to the laundry room on the upper level. From there you can get out through the side exit. I can't leave you. You have no choice." The door cracked again, this time louder, deeper. Maria sobbed, shaking her head, but Ethan didn't give her time to argue. He helped her climb onto the bed, then lifted her into the vent. She crawled in, her hands trembling as she pulled herself forward. Before she disappeared, she whispered, "Senor Ethan, thank you." He managed a tight, reassuring nod. She crawled deeper until the darkness swallowed her. Ethan replaced the vent cover just as the door exploded open. Wood shattered, hinges snapped. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, his face half covered by a black mask, his eyes cold and merciless. Behind him, 2 more men. Ethan stood alone in the center of the room. The leader looked around slowly, scanning every corner. His eyes narrowed. "No maid," he muttered. "Interesting." His gaze locked onto Ethan. "And who?" he sneered. "Are you supposed to be?" Ethan straightened his posture, forcing calm into his voice. "This is my house." The leader smirked. "Not tonight." The man stepped closer. Ethan didn't flinch, but deep inside, he knew. He had just become the new target, and the nightmare was only beginning. As we move even deeper into this revelation, it becomes clear that nothing shown here is random or symbolic in a superficial way. On the contrary, every detail seems to carry a spiritual precision that challenges logic and confronts the human heart. And now, in this 6th part of the journey, we enter one of the most sensitive and mysterious points, one that touches directly on the daily choices of every human being, even those who believe they are spiritually safe. Many people imagine that evil manifests only through grand events, visible threats, or dramatic signs. But here, the revelation shows something entirely different. Evil often acts silently, subtly, almost imperceptibly. It infiltrates thoughts, emotions, relationships, and even the quietest routines of a home. There is a hidden battle taking place behind the curtains of everyday life, and most people never notice. And that is exactly where the greatest danger lies. In this part, the description focuses on a dark spiritual influence that does not come from outside, but tries to arise from within, fed by fear, anxiety, doubt, and spiritual exhaustion. It is like a fog settling over the mind and heart, slowly, without noise, without announcing its presence, yet draining a person's strength until their faith becomes fragile and vulnerable. The striking truth is that this negative spiritual force chooses no age, no culture, no profession, no social standing. It simply seeks those who are distracted, overwhelmed, emotionally tired, or spiritually unprotected, and that is why so many believe they are spiritually stable when, in reality, they are exposed without realizing. The revelation continues, showing with unsettling clarity that many homes which appear peaceful on the outside are silently being shaken from within. Conflicts begin small, almost invisible. A harsh word spoken in irritation, a thought of discouragement that returns repeatedly, a spiritual habit abandoned just for today, a prayer skipped because there wasn't enough time, a small resentment left unresolved until it grows into a wall of emotional separation. It is precisely in these small, overlooked moments that evil finds fertile ground to take root, expand, and create internal disruption. The description then reveals that once this spiritual fog settles in, the entire atmosphere changes. The air feels heavier, relationships become strained, patience fades, dreams are replaced by constant worries, and hope slowly dims like a candle flickering against an unseen wind. And whenever someone tries to strengthen themselves spiritually, unexpected distractions appear, sudden discouragement emerges, or an unexplainable tiredness takes over, almost as if something is trying to stop the return of light. One of the most unsettling aspects of this revelation is not what evil does, but where it operates, in the very places where peace should flourish. Homes that were once emotional sanctuaries gradually turn into silent battlegrounds. People who were once close begin drifting apart. Hearts that were once strong begin to hesitate. None of this happens suddenly. It unfolds in stages, slowly, as if someone were turning off the lights one by one, until only the darkness remains. And then comes a powerful sentence in the revelation, a warning that echoes with spiritual urgency. The enemy strikes in silence long before he strikes in chaos. A phrase that carries deep spiritual wisdom, reminding us that before major breakdowns, there are always small signs that go unnoticed. Before collapse, there is neglect, and before a spiritual fall, there is always distraction. But as we approach the final section of this part, the revelation goes even deeper, showing that, as the revelation unfolds into its final stage, something profound begins to shift. The atmosphere, previously thick with tension, spiritual fog, and unspoken fear, suddenly sharpens with a clarity that feels almost supernatural. It is as if a veil that had covered everything is now being lifted, layer by layer, revealing the truth that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. And now, everything converges. Every warning, every sign, every silence, every moment of doubt, every internal battle, all of it leads to a single point where the explanation finally appears, clear, luminous, and impossible to deny. The revelation begins explaining that darkness never had the final word, never had absolute power, and never controlled destiny in the way many feared. The silent infiltration, the emotional fog, the spiritual weakening, it all had one goal: to make a person forget that they were never alone. Because the greatest victory of evil is not destruction, it is convincing someone that they have no protection, no hope, and no way out. But the moment a heart begins to awaken, even if only by a whisper, a tear, a memory, or a small spark of faith, something extraordinary happens. A divine intervention enters not with noise, not with fire, but with a quiet authority that dissolves darkness the same way dawn dissolves the night. Slowly at first, then completely. The vision now reveals scenes of people who thought they were too broken, too lost, too spiritually damaged to be reached. Mothers praying alone in the kitchen after midnight, fathers staring at the ceiling wondering where everything went wrong, young people drowning in silent despair, elderly hearts aching from years of loneliness. But suddenly, each one of them is surrounded by a light that is soft, yet unshakably strong, a light that does not judge but embraces, restores, and rewrites. And then the revelation shows something even more astonishing. Every prayer whispered in exhaustion was heard. Every tear shed in silence was counted. Every moment of despair was accompanied. Every fall was met with a hand ready to lift. It becomes clear now that the true battle was never between the person and the darkness. It was between the darkness and the love that never abandoned the person, not for a second. And then, at the height of the revelation, a voice speaks. Not harsh, not loud, but with the gentle firmness of eternal truth. Light waits longer than darkness fights, and love reaches farther than despair can fall. This sentence echoes like a divine decree, reshaping the entire meaning of everything revealed so far. The fog that had clouded the mind is shown, dissolving. The emotional weight that suffocated the heart is lifted. The silent attacks that drained strength lose their power. The chains that bound the spirit start breaking one by one. But there is still something left, something that only now becomes visible. The purpose behind all of this. You finally see it. The reason the darkness fought so hard was because the destiny of the person it attacked was far greater than the darkness ever wanted to admit. The revelation shows a future that had been hidden. A path of restoration, strength, wisdom, and victory. Not a life free from battles, but a life empowered to win them. Not a heart free from pain, but a heart strong enough to transform pain into purpose. Not a soul untouched by fear, but a soul that learns to walk through fear without bowing to it. The final image is powerful beyond words. A person standing after everything, stronger, wiser, humbled, but unbroken. Light wraps around them like a cloak. A divine hand rests over their heart, and the darkness, once so threatening, retreats like a shadow that never had the right to stay. And then comes the final revelation, the one reserved only for the enemy attacked because you carry a purpose bigger than he could ever stop. And every moment you thought you were alone was the moment heaven was fighting for. The vision closes with a final message, one that seals everything with clarity. Peace. You were never abandoned. You were never forgotten. You were never hopeless. The light that protects you is eternal. And just like that, the revelation ends. Not with fear, but with certainty. Not with confusion, but with understanding. Not with darkness, but with the assurance that whoever reaches the end of this journey emerges transformed, forever.